YouTube theologians, how are you today? I've got a theory here. I got to write about this a little bit, and that is that human thinking devolves into two different categories. That you might have a philosophy, but you end up having to have a practical philosophy. Everyone does, a kind of a thing that drives their thinking and more their feeling and their acting. And my theory is that those two practical philosophies or ways of living divide up into, on the one hand, pain is bad. Like that's the chief rule. Pain is bad, so you want to avoid pain. Maybe seek after pleasure, but at least avoid pain. Or on the other side, it's the idea that good is good, which is a tautology, but it still is that the highest thing is goodness or virtue or some definition of good. And those two things sometimes they can be together, sometimes they compete with each other, but they've shown up in the history of the world under the names Epicureanism, pain's bad, or Stoicism, good is good. That's at least my own way of, I'm trying to oversimplify these things so I can understand them. Now, what's interesting is that, when we study the Greek philosophers, we study Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and all these other guys that I can't remember, who were all trying to figure out what everything was made out of, and they were thinking and reasoning and doing all this sort of stuff. Well, by time St. Paul gets to Athens in like the year 40, and he stands there on Mars Hill, well, who are the guys that are left? The Stoics and the Epicureans. Just kind of, our human thinking just kind of devolves down those two paths, and they're always fighting. The Epicureans, pain is bad, and the Stoics, good is good, are always fighting with each other. Now there's not like a single doctrine. It's not like you can find a book of Concord for Epicurus or a book of Confessions for the Stoics. They all the different teachers are teaching different things, and they're always fighting against each other. But those two broad ideas are really what's governed society. So I got a theory on this, and that is that if that's true, if you take that premise to be true, then here's my second premise, and that is that for the last couple hundred years, and most especially for the last 50 years, our own culture has been shaped by Epicureanism. And we see this in the engine that drives the sexual revolution that we're in, or the kind of the free love of the 60s, or the just do it of the Nike commercials, or even like the argument that we were hearing in Colorado about legalized euthanasia. Look, isn't it better to die than to have to suffer all of this pain? Well, that's Epicurean. Pain is bad. Pain is the worst of all. In fact, what if we summarize them like this? Pain is the worst, Epicureanism, and good is the best, Stoicism. Now, the church and Epicureanism when you study Epicurus, it's interesting. He had the idea that the two things that cause us the most trouble in this world is the idea that God intervenes, and that there'll be a judgment in the afterlife. So you have to throw those two doctrines out to live a peaceful life. But Epicureanism really quickly degenerates into a sort of hedonistic Epicureanism. The eat, drink, and be merry, tomorrow we may die. Now, this is not, it's a caricature of what Epicurus taught, but it's a caricature that people love. And that's the Epicureanism that St. Paul's up against. He mentions it in 1 Corinthians 15. Eat and drink, tomorrow we die. Because there's nothing that happens after death, so do what you want to do. There's no restraining thing, no worrying about God's judgment. So that was Epicurus, and that's completely antithetical to the Christian doctrine. I mean, that God intervenes in the world and that there's a judgment. That's in the top 10 list of things that you probably ought to believe if you're reading the Bible. So Epicureanism and Christianity have never quite got along, which is probably the root of the culture wars that we've been watching unfold for the past 30 years. I mean, the church has to stand against this sexual revolution and say, what are you guys doing? But what's interesting, and here's maybe point 3 of this whole thing, and I got a blog on this that it's written down if it's easier to follow with your eyes instead of your ears. But the third thing is that if it's true that Epicureanism is sort of the driving engine of our major cultural force, then we would expect, and now we are seeing, a backlash of Stoicism. Good is good. You should do the right thing. You should tough it out. You should not avoid pain at all costs because some pain is good, and so forth and so on. And we're starting to see it. Especially, look at this. Can you guys see this huge line right there? That is a line for the Chick-fil-A. Look at all those people lined up for Chick-fil-A. It's unbelievable. Might not even be any chickens left around here. What were we talking about? Sorry. I'm like the dog who sees a squirrel. Except for I see Chick-fil-A lines. Stoicism, oh yeah. So if Epicureanism is the driving, then we would expect to see something like a cultural backlash of Stoicism, and we see it. Now, you see a guy like Jordan Peterson's basically a Stoic, or Joe Rogan, one of the most popular podcasts, or Tim Ferriss, who lives around here somewhere, of the Tim Ferriss Show. That guy's a Stoic. He publishes a daily Stoic thing, and you can get the Daily Stoic app, and all these guys are reading Stoicism. Now, there's a danger here, and that is that while Christians are always fighting with the Epicureans, there are similarities between Christianity and Stoicism. Stoicism says that virtue is to be pursued, that there's suffering that's worth suffering, and so forth. And if you're used to looking at Epicureans, in other words, if the culture used to be Epicureans, which were chasing after pleasure, and then Christians who were trying to do the right thing, you look at a Stoic and you're like, hey, you look a lot like a Christian, it's fooled some people. It's amazing how, you just ask people if they think Jordan Peterson is a Christian. No, he doesn't. He reads the Bible, but he doesn't believe that Jesus rose from the dead. He's like a Jungian psychologist. But he ends up looking an awful lot like a Christian because there are connections between Christianity and Stoicism. But there are major differences, and to that end, I want to commend to some reading to you. Now, there's this guy, Lightfoot. He was an old, maybe he lived 150 years ago, and he wrote Bible commentaries and some other stuff. He wrote some poems and things. And I was reading a couple years ago his commentary on Philippians, and at the end of that little book, he has a section on Paul and Seneca. I'm going to put a link to this in the comments because I downloaded the commentary and I just cut out those pages, Paul and Seneca. I think it's like 30 pages or something like that. And you can download the PDF, and that's what I want to commend to you. Because what Lightfoot does is he takes on this old idea that Paul and Seneca, who lived at the same time, maybe Paul was a little bit younger than Seneca, that they corresponded and wrote letters to one another. Now, that's not true, at least as far as anybody can tell that's not true, but there is some interesting connections. Number one, Paul was from Tarsus, which is like the hotbed of Stoicism back in the day. Number two, Paul appears before Gallio in Corinth. Remember when Paul goes to Corinth and he's dragged before the Bema seat, and there's Gallio, and it looks like Paul's going to be kicked out of town or stoned again, and then Gallio says, what? He's fine. What's the deal? He's fine. Well, that Gallio is the brother of Seneca, the great Stoic philosopher, which is kind of amazing. Now, I think what Lightfoot is going to conclude in this whole thing is that Seneca knew Moses and the prophets, and Paul knew Seneca, their doctrine and teaching. But neither here nor there, what Lightfoot does is he shows how the gospel is better. How Stoicism is fine, but it doesn't get you there. And the gospel of Jesus is better than this. In fact, I had this idea of making this kind of bait and switch book out of this little section from Lightfoot and like putting up quotes from Seneca, because there's so many Seneca quotes, and publishing a book that says quotes from Seneca, and then publishing this Lightfoot thing as an addendum so that the people who are interested in Seneca would see how the gospel's better. how both Christians and Stoics have something like a law which says do good and serve your neighbor and live a good life, but that Christianity tells you why, and Christianity also tells you what, and more so, Christianity has a completely different doctrine that stands alongside the law, which is the gospel, that says that you can try to be good, but you cannot be good enough to make God happy. God's smile comes only from the death and resurrection of Jesus. So anyway, I would love for you guys to reflect on these things with me by reading this little article. So I'll put the links there below, and I'd love to see your comments. You can comment on the blog, or you can comment on this video, and we'll talk to you more soon. God's peace be with you.